We're here on a week that is a big news week for Iran policy watchers. This would be a big week just by virtue of the fact that we have seen Implementation Day. That is the day when the nuclear deal that was negotiated between the United States and Iran to great fanfare last July comes into force. It means that Iran has met so far the terms of the deal that, as far as the U.S. is concerned, and gets the big benefit that they were promised, which is relief from the most onerous of the nuclear-related sanctions, as well as the unfreezing of $100 billion worth of assets. Maybe $50 billion of that is already dedicated to pay off some debts, but $50 billion of mad money now available to the Iranian leaders. It's the mark of a new era in U.S.-Iranian nuclear relations. Coincidental with this deal, or maybe not coincidental, and I'd be curious for you whether you think it's a coincidence or not. Two other big news items on the Iran front. First, Iran seized two small naval vessels, seized it that had strayed into their waters. There was an equipment malfunction, and they seized the sailors, held them at gunpoint, paraded them before the TV in a rather embarrassing way. And for a couple days, it looked like we had another Iranian hostage crisis right on around the time when the Implementation Day was supposed to be struck. But then Implementation Day went forward, and they released the sailors. Moreover, they released 4 of other hostages that Iran had seized over the last several years, including the Washington Post reporter and a Iranian-American pastor who had been visiting, and others, in exchange for President Obama declaring clemency on 7 Iranian Americans who had been found guilty of violating sanctions, helping Iran build illicit materials, and then also the U.S. agreeing not to pursue some dozen to 20 others. So a deal that came under criticism because that seemed like a high price to pay. We let free people who had broken international law, and the Iranians set free people who should not have been held. And who the holding of them was violating international law. It was the classic kind of bad deal that Republicans have said this administration repeatedly strikes. I think the administration probably had some sense it wasn't a great deal because they took pains to emphasize that this was a deal without precedent. It was not setting precedent. They were not going to do this again. But nevertheless, the combination of all these things, Implementation Day, getting the sailors back, getting the hostages released, suggests maybe the ushering in of an era of new feeling. So what do we take from this?
So yeah, it really is interesting because I think that, well, first of all, it's interesting obviously because the importance of Iran as a policy issue and as a political issue in a presidential season. But for us, with our professor hats on, this is the kind of case that's really rich for students to look at, right? So the great debate about Iran when the nuclear treaty was signed, was this going to be transactional? Not simply transactional, it was a big deal in and of itself, or did it have the possibility to become transformational, right? That would be, the first step in broader transformation of the overall relationship with a country that had been an adversary for almost 40 years, right? So on the Implementation Day, granted, there's, we're 90 days into, or a little more than that, into a deal that's going to last 10 years, we don't know for sure. But it is a big deal, the steps that they took in terms of shipping out the highly enriched uranium, closing up the plutonium reactor, and dramatically cutting their centrifuges, right? And also some interactions with the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, right? So I think that's significant in itself. But the other questions that it raises, right? So let's take them one by one. On the naval incident, right? By all accounts, from Defense Secretary Ash Carter and others, the American boat ships were in Iranian waters. How they got there, why they got there, whether it was a malfunction or a misnavigation, we don't really know yet, right? And they were there, and I think the first thing Americans saw was the scene on the boat, which was, it wasn't Argo, but it was what many people remember, even if they weren't alive then they've seen it of the hostage taking. So the images on the news that night.
They were evocative of bad Iran.
Hands behind their hands behind their backs and saying things they're told to say. The fact, though, is that this was resolved pretty quickly. And the key to it being resolved, one of the keys was the relationship and the line of communication developed between Secretary of State Kerry and the Iranian, Foreign Minister Zarif, right? So they were able to talk. What we don't know, and everybody will have their theories, is what was going on in Iran, right? Now, you're more of a naval guy than I am, but my understanding is that, if something comes into your territorial waters, you automatically act upon it. Was this then say, hey, they call the Revolutionary Guard, say, hey, we got an opportunity to really do something that the president of Iran doesn't like? We don't really know how this played in. They've got an election next one. But I think that, this is one of the areas, if you go back to détente, U.S.-Soviet détente, incidents at sea and search and rescue was one of the first areas of agreement that we reached, even before the big nuclear deals. And in the Middle East, I was working a lot in the mid-90s on some regional arms control talks when the Israeli-Palestinian peace process was going. We actually had 15 Arab navies and the Israeli Navy working on incidents at sea and search and rescue and had draft agreements. So I think this points out the need for that kind of agreement as a follow-on. My sense is it demonstrates what happens when you build communications and stakes in the relationship, right? So, I think incidents can happen. That video will be used a lot, I suspect, in the presidential campaign season. But at a policy level, I think the net comes out positive for incidents happen, what do you do about them, right?
So I agree, and let's concede up front that if the sailors had not been returned, then this would have been taken as strong evidence that the deal was a bust. So the fact that they were returned is clearly a net positive for those who would argue that this was potentially transformational. But I'm not sure that bargaining theory isn't indeterminate on this, right? So there's two ways bargaining theory would have you interpret the nuclear deal. One is that progress begets progress. This is the transformational argument, that we learn to get along with each other, we make baby steps, and that leads to ever more degrees of trust that allow us to reach greater agreements. And some of the events of the last week would fit that story. But the other thing that bargaining theory might lead you to expect is that if one side makes a deal that they found painful, and the Iranians have claimed they found the nuclear deal painful to them, then they will compensate by making hardline gestures to sort of satisfy their hardline base.
Right.
So bargaining theory leads us to expect if you have a deal, you're either going to get cooperation or you're not going to get cooperation. That's a prediction that can't be proven wrong.
Right. So we have an empirical case here, which, and in some ways how it's interpreted, you and I, of course, wouldn't do such a thing, but many people will interpret it with their pre-existing framework.
No,
right?
I would never do that.
Right, we would never do that, of course not. But nevertheless, I think, so it is an interesting case. I mean, it may well be, as we look back 5 years from now, it may be inconsequential. But somebody may actually say it's a crisis that was useful to have because it was an opportunity to demonstrate that you could get more cooperation. I mean, that's speculating on the future, but I think the way that it was handled, and even the way that the embarrassing parts were really kept to a minimum. Reports so far are, none of the, the sailors said that they were mistreated in any physical or psychological way. It happened really quickly. We don't know enough about Iranian decision making. I think that's a big deal, not a given. So
fair enough. What about the other question, though? Was did Obama pay too high a price? This is a recurring thing. Yeah, on the prisoners, because that was the criticism on the nuclear deal. That's the criticism on Cuba, on the getting the AWOL soldier back.
Right.
I mean, Bergdahl. It's a recurring criticism. This isn't the first time.
Right. So I would say on the Bergdahl case, I totally agree. I think that was not a well calculated bargain in and of itself. Okay. Given the guy, a whole variety of things. I don't agree on Cuba at all, but we won't talk about that today. To me, so I think here you have a situation. I mean, there are some arguments there that our journalists and others were not criminals and these were criminals as they're equating. But you think of all the other examples, it's very hard to find that. When Nicholas Daniloff, the American U.S. News reporter in around 1985, was taken prisoner in Moscow, We got him freed in exchange for some people that were convicted as spies. When the Israelis get back one soldier, and they're pretty tough negotiators, that they free lots of Palestinians. I think it was very important, and I think it was, it was sensitive, obviously. The story's still coming out about what happened in those last 15 hours. But I think it was the kind of deal that demonstrates that we have our priorities, and our priorities are our people. I don't think this is going to set some precedent that people are going to go seize Americans. They said that, a whole variety of other times. They're going to seize Americans because they're going to seize Americans, right, if ISIS or anybody does it. But I think this took away another difficult issue. It was very important for the people that were involved, particularly the Washington Post reporter. So again, I see this as a net positive.
Well, this is where political science allows us to make predictions, right? So
Okay.
if you're right, then we should see over the next several months progress on multiple fronts. Maybe slow, but progress. If folks say the Iranians took advantage of us, if that line is right, then we should see perhaps an Iranian overreaction to the token missile sanctions that the president reimposed, or other steps we could see lack of progress. So if that, either way, we'll be back and
we'll see. I think it's fair to say, that it's not just up to us. There'll be a lot of other factors that throw in, but it really is an interesting issue for us to continue on in a serious way, and maybe to put on the next exam we give to our PhD students about how they would interpret it.
A great exam question.
All right, good.
Great.
As always.